chapter 9 of Theologico-Political Treatise by Baruch Spinoza. And in this chapter, he tries to go through the books that we say, I mentioned in the previous video that he tells us were written by Ezra. And he tries to to illustrate, in fact, he does a very good job of illustrating the errors that occur in those books. And he also, at the end of it, tells us what he thinks caused those errors to appear or to happen in the book. And in fact, his conclusion is that most of those errors are not by design. It's not somebody who decided that they should be there. It's also not negligence. Most of them, that's what he thinks, that most of them are not because of negligence. He gives us another reason, which is more of acceptable. I'm going to tell you what the reason he thinks, the major reason he thinks there are so many errors in the books. Now, the books he is analyzing are 12 books. I forgot to mention in the previous video that there are 12 books that he says he believes were written by Ezra. And those 12 books are the books that are known as the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then historical books, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, and King, First Samuel, Second Samuel, First Kings, Second Kings. So those are the books he believes were written by Ezra. Of course, I told you that he does explain why he thinks it's Ezra who wrote these books. Now, in this chapter 9, he looks at the particular glaring errors that occur in these books. And one type of error that he illustrates or explains very well or describes very well comes down to years, dating of events and the time of particular kings, for example, of people who lived, things like that. Like there's so much, there's a lot of things that don't make sense when it comes to dating in these books, that it's mind-boggling. Like if you look at it, you are like, how did this happen? Now, for example, he tells us about the time frame between when Joseph was abducted and sold by his brothers, then he ended up being sold in Egypt. And during that time he was in Egypt until there was a reunion between him and his family. We are told of things that happened in Egypt, him being arrested, being thrown in jail, and it's easy for you to calculate the amount of time that passed while he was in Egypt, since the time he was taken from his home, at the time he ended up reuniting with the family. Now, at the same time, when you read the Bible, the events that took place with his family are also explained or described. Now, when you add the years that these events that happened with his family, how many years went by, and the years that went by while he was in Egypt, they don't match. Like there's a huge discrepancy that it doesn't even make sense, because when you try to work with those numbers, then you realize we have to assume that some of the people mentioned who got married, they got married at the age of 7, for example, and had kids who they were grandfathers at the age of 17, something like that. I might be wrong in describing how he actually does it, but he does a very good job trying to make you see those errors when it comes to dating. And there are so many others regarding time that when you start digging into the Bible and trying to arrange things, events, the way they are described in same book, sometimes in different books, but the same events, then you arrive at very weird unrealistic time frames. Now, the other type of errors that he explains or he illustrates in this chapter have to do with errors that are incomplete sentences in the Bible, in some books, mutilated text, empty spaces between words and sentences. And he goes into detail to try to show us as many of these as he could in the chapter, and in fact he is able to make it very clear to us that there are so many of these errors in the Bible that it doesn't even make sense how they remain there. Like if there was somebody doing some simple editing, proofreading kind of thing, then these errors would not have remained. They would have been sorted out, but they are there, and they've remained there. And some people have used these errors, or they've tried to explain these errors as if there's something profound and magical or behind them. Like that's how some people try. And in fact, Baruch does talk about that in this chapter. He says some people want to run away from these errors, and by the way they try to do that is by trying to explain them in another way. Like they try to, instead of acknowledging them that they are errors in the Bible, they try to make them mysterious, and kind of like the Bible gets even more of its power from these errors. So he talks about that. Now, as far as okay, there are also errors that occur. Okay, maybe these are not errors. He talks of corruption. Maybe I'll come to corruption later. Let's talk of these errors. Now, his explanation of as to why these errors are there, especially in these 12 books that Ezra wrote, he says he has two theories, or he has one theory, and then he doesn't know if it's not that, then he doesn't understand what was happening. He says that his theory is that Ezra died before he could harmonize. It's like Ezra took these books and in fact, there's something else I need to explain about this. He says the source of most of these errors is that Ezra was taking chunks of text from different sources and trying to build one document, in particular specific books and also the entire like Bible or a huge section of it. And while he was picking these texts, and in fact Baruch explains specific sections of specific parts of these books where he says this seems like was picked from a different book and this from a different book. And he says Ezra was doing this, and maybe he had the intention of coming back later and trying to harmonize all these narratives so that they are more in tune. But he says seems like most likely he died before he could do that, and nobody else took it up to clean up these documents, and then they were just passed on up to date, and the errors still remain there. And in due course, the sources that he was using were lost. So even if somebody tried today to correct those errors, there's no way you can do it, because nobody has access to the sources that Ezra had. That's what Baruch says. So he says maybe that time the people who lived around that time were a better placed to correct these errors, but they did not for some reason. And then these errors now have remained with the Bible to date, and nobody can do anything about them except try to explain them as being mysterious or having some hidden messages behind them. Okay, now, besides these errors that he says came about as a result of Ezra collecting information from different sources and just putting them in one document, and then for some reason he didn't come back to clean it up, to harmonize these narratives, he says there are also faults and corruptions that have crept into the Bible over time. This can be a very touchy topic, of course, especially for people who are believers. And they hold the Bible to be a sacred book, so trying to talk about some of these things. And in fact, even Baruch himself acknowledges this. He says sometimes how people hold the Bible today, it limits them when it comes trying to interrogate its accuracy, its authority, its how efficient the people who wrote it were. It becomes a problem because some people are like, that's a no-go zone. But he says, no, you have to do that. So he says, there are these corruptions that have happened over time, that the people who had these documents, and even the documents, the original primary sources that the people like Ezra used, were handled within the society. And he says, he shows us examples from the Bible itself that there were similar stories that were told in different ways. And he says the only way we can explain this is that there were several versions of the same story or the same document in circulation. And sometimes people like Ezra were picking these stories, and they will pick from different sources, and then there will be this, you read this section of the Bible is talking about the same story, you read this other section is talking about the same story, but the details are not really the same. And he says, for him, he interprets that to mean that there was different versions of the same document or story in circulation during that time. And so he says that alone tells us there were corruptions that could happen, because these are documents that were handwritten for the most part, of course, and then they will be written, copied, and during this process, some people could easily change some things to fit their own interests. And in fact, he does mention about the conflict that existed for a very long time within the Jewish society of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. These two sects held kind of different approaches to different questions, and so they were kind of like competing, and often both sides used to publish the same document but different details. He does tell us about this. In fact, I'm going to talk more about this in the next video. And so he tells us that all these led to some errors occurring, not errors, some corruption occurring in the Bible. And in fact, there were situations where the Bible was revised, or some of the books were revised to fit the current narratives. He talks of current social norms. In fact, he talks about that when the originals were written, it wasn't a big deal to talk about reproductive organs, for example, and sex and things like that. But over time, it became a taboo to talk about those things. And now the people went, at some point, some people went back and revised the Bible so that it doesn't talk about these things the way it was used to talk about it. And of course, now for them it was for the good, but then you are losing the original mind or idea or intentions. He also talks about the editing or changing of the text because of changing language use. Language use changes over time. Even just in 50 years, language changes very much, and you can imagine 1,000 years, 2,000 years, how much language changes. And during that time, when at some point the people read these texts and kind of like the language has changed so much and they had to upgrade. And during this upgrade, corruptions will occur, sometimes unintended, sometimes intended. So he does talk about all those. But his conclusion is we shouldn't take these errors to be sources of mystery or some kind of hidden meanings. He says we should acknowledge them for what they are, and then we interpret them that way.